Yeah, it's real interesting as far as the view of Jesus. I would like to start out, even though I titled this Arius and his view of Jesus, which I will touch on. That's what this vlog is about. I want to start off giving my own little perspective, like what I think about Jesus. Like me personally, uh, reading this information and going a little bit more in depth because I went deep with my research. You know what I'm saying? A lot of things that I found out about complements what I personally think about the person of Jesus. I think more than likely, I think it's highly probable that he existed, even though I don't necessarily agree with everything that's attached to this person of Jesus. But historically speaking, I think he is a human being that actually walked the planet Earth or whatnot back in the day. Not to like not for example, like when I read about Iranius, right? I'm not taking from his logic. This is what I always thought, like it's based on me reading about Islamic history and everything that's pertaining more so to the life of Muhammad when he lived. When I do a parallel, right, when I think about it and I compare like the life of a Jesus to a Muhammad, as far as Muhammad, the earliest information that was written about him was compiled 100 years after he died or whatnot, and then another hundred years after that, that's when books was finally published about him. So you're talking about 200 years from the moment that he walked the planet Earth or whatnot, and not to mention like his grandsons, like a guy named Al Hussein, and then another guy named Al Husan or whatever. You got grave sites, you got historical locations for these people, and it helps to tell a story about the life of Muhammad. And there's many other grave sites and relics and things like that. When you compare that to a Jesus, or at least when I compare it in my mind, a lot of the things that was put out regarding the life of Jesus was put out during the same century that he died, because he died anytime between 28 and what 32 AD, depending on when you actually pinpoint the date of his birth. And as far as like what I mentioned about Uranius in his book Against Heresies, he made a good point that I agree with. He was talking about like what he was really trying to like refute heretics and people like that. His point more so concerned like, okay, it's kind of similar to what I'm gonna mention about Bishop Clement in 1 second. Like you got to basically a foundation. You got persons that could be traced in reverse chronological order, as far as like the first bishops of the church or popes of the church. Now, he counted more so those that lived in Rome, starting with Peter and Paul, those that, resided there. And then he went after Peter and then he gave like a list of like 12, 11 or 12 bishops or whatnot. That makes complete sense to me. And my logic kind of follows that because like Jesus, for example, the way I look at him, he's not just like a deity. He's not like a mere concept that you pull out of the air. This is putting aside any like interpretations regarding him. As far as the actual humanness of this person, he had to have existed. These 12 apostles that lived during his time, and then including those 12 first bishops of Rome, they didn't just come out of nowhere. They didn't just walk out of darkness and then appear on the planet Earth. You know what I'm saying? So it's highly probable, in my opinion, that he existed. And as far as like some of the earliest purported writings, you got at least two people that's mainly mentioned. As far as my research, a guy named Papias, and then another guy named Polycarp. Papias, for example, he lived in a place called Hierapolis, Turkey. That's where he was from or whatnot. And he was born in 60 AD, and then he died sometime in 130 AD. As far as Polycarp, I believe he was born in, or was Papias born in 69? It could have been 69 AD to 155 AD. And then Polycarp later on was born in like 155 AD, died sometime around 220 AD, but sometime during the early third century or whatnot. A lot of like as far as conventional wisdom is concerned, when you research like what's the earliest writings or documents, of people that speak about Jesus, those are the two names that's gonna come up. But it's other people outside of those two, but those persons are more so considered like heretics, for example. Some of them, I'm gonna say the majority of them live after the life of Papias, but still, like they represent like documentation, like Tertullian, for example. But again, going back to those two persons, as far as me doing my research, it's another guy, Bishop Clement, for example. He came out with a letter written in 96 AD to the people of Corinthian, Greece, or whatnot. As far as like the church there, you had like people that was turning like they were called dissidents or whatever. Like they wasn't really going along with the overall foundational opinion, and that is even deeper within itself. But I'm not gonna veer. I'm gonna stay right on this point. They wasn't going along with the overall teachings or whatever. So in his letter, he was basically quoting a lot of scriptures, and then he kind of used some of some logic that's similar to what Irenaeus put forth in his book, which is that you got a foundation here, and if you go in reverse chronological order, these people all they date back to the lifetime of Jesus, going back to his apostles or whatever. So any type of ideals or lessons or teachings that is not in accord with that, it has to be erroneous. But see, I go further with that and say, okay, even if you don't necessarily agree with the teachings, you have to say the person of Jesus existed. Now, before I go further, I want to reference another group that I found out about that I never knew anything about, and they're called the Ebionites, right? They were basically a poor population located in Jerusalem, right? The center of this history, basically. And when you read about them, they're dated as early as the time of Emperor Nero, going back to 70 AD, even though Emperor Nero died 2 years before that, 68 AD. But as far as like documentations about those people, you get more documentations in the next century, the early second century, and then so forth. In fact, like this, they were like considered Jewish Christians, and they kind of ended up splitting from well, when they ended up splitting, the second faction was called the Nazarenes. Now, I heard a lot about them, but originally the Nazarenes were considered the Ebionites, and they were basically just kind of categorized collectively as a poor population that believed in Jesus, but Judaic Christians, but they didn't believe in a virgin birth. That was significant to me. So when you think about them going back as far as 70 AD, that's when the early first 12 bishops of the Church of Rome come to mind. This is what I was processing as I was doing my research or whatever. That's why I say like this is I'm gonna say this ahead of time. The history is so fucking deep. I decided to give the topic a little bit more respect. What do I mean by that? A lot of early theologians, and a lot of them were bishops as well. They wrote like extensively on the topic. Many of them within themselves did not believe in the virgin birth either. Tertullian, for example. Actually, yeah, Tertullian, for example. And then another guy called Paul of Samosata, Turkey. And as far as Arius, who this blog is about, his teachings are traced back to him because Arius was a student of a guy who was a student of Paul, a guy named Lucian. But anyway, before I go, because I'm trying to stay in chronological order, I want to say also, like I was saying, like a lot of those people I want to do like specific vlogs about because I feel like if I try to include them all in this vlog, it'll be too much veering. And I don't like to speak in like headers. I like to break down shit because it's interesting. So like after this vlog, my next major vlog is chapter 3, Legends, of Lies, the Civil War. But just like I did with chapter 2, when I did like a separate vlog after that about Anthony Johnson, John Kosor, John Punch, I'm gonna kind of do that with these people, but I'm gonna do it in more than just one separate vlog. It's gonna be quite a few of them before I get to chapter 3, only because I want to do the topic so much justice, and I feel like, even though this is more so about Arius, It's just too much interesting information aside from Arius himself, like the Ebionites, for example, what I just mentioned with them. That's too fucking significant to just brush over, and especially being that they did not believe in the virgin birth. And here's the weird part: like again, when you read this type of information, you got to ascertain for yourself and analyze. What is also purported, generally speaking, regarding the Ebionites is that one of the main gospels that they read from was the book of Matthew. Now, I took it upon myself to read specifically about the virgin birth of Jesus because, as y'all already know, my perspective is my overall perspective, metaphysics, physics, and all that. It's not really tailored specifically to the Bible as some of the reasons I already put forth. But and them mentioning the Ebionites and me reading about them and it's claimed that they use the book of Matthew as well, like one of their main premises, it doesn't make sense to me personally because, like for example, the virgin birth thing makes sense to me because that's where Jesus come from. It is not too far from what I believe as far as the actual reality of the human being of Jesus, because everything that's written about him is from other people. Even though they may have lived contemporarily with him during his lifetime, you still got to consider their comprehension and educational level, and the fact that a lot of people did speak in metaphors and parables. I get to further to that in a second when I talk about a guy named Ananias in the book of Acts. But as far as the Ebionites, I'm like, how is it that they could, they use the book of Matthew as one of their main premises, as it is claimed, yet in that book in itself, it's obvious that they mention Jesus being born through a virgin birth. That doesn't make sense. Like I read the other two books, I mean, other three as well, like Luke, John, and Mark. Okay, in John and Mark, it's not really mentioned as far as the virgin birth. And Luke and Matthews, it is. But if the Ebionites go back that far, and they basically were contemporaries with many of the early 12 apostles who still lived during that time, how is it that they will accept the book of Matthews, especially when the book of Mark is considered the oldest book? Probably not that much older than the other three gospels, but it's still considered, generally speaking, through scholars on the topic, the earliest book. So how is it that they will accept the book of Matthews as their main premise? That doesn't make sense to me. That's questionable to me. That means somebody that had a shit together when they put this information out. But whatever. They were contemporaries with the early 12 apostles. Now, as I was talking about when I started this, you got many people that got interpretations about Jesus, even though they were considered heretics. The thing is, as far as the Ebionites, they also, and I got this from reading like chapters in Irenaeus's book Against Heresies. He states clearly that as far as their position, they don't accept the apostle Paul as a authority on the topic. Now, to me, that part makes sense. Again, the purported fact about them reading the book of Matthews, that doesn't make sense. Even though I can understand people like take it from here and there, blah, blah, blah. But as far as like the little information that's put out there, the book of Matthews, that would be like a theme within that book in itself as far as the virgin of Jesus. That's like one of the most important facets of information. So I question that. So like as far as the Ebionites, I feel like I wouldn't really do too much justice, and it'd take too much time out of this vlog for me to include them, because there's a whole bunch of other people that I wanted to include, but I'm gonna briefly speak on and just do like specific, quick, not even really quick, but specific or tailored vlogs about them, like Tertullian, for example, Sibelius, for example, Marcion, for example. Even though I'm going to mention them throughout this vlog, Irenaeus, for example, because his book is the longest one. It's like 5 different books all in one, collectively referred to as Against Heresies. But it's a lot of fucking chapters within that book that is so fucking interesting. As I'm reading it, and I'm like, man, I could do like a 20-minute vlog about this chapter within itself, which would definitely come out more rich if I tailor it like that. That's what I'm saying. So a lot of this stuff I'm gonna touch on again before I get to the chapter 3 of Legends and Lies of Civil War. But going back as far as the first 12 bishops of the Church of Rome following Saint Peter, because Saint Peter, I think his papacy was from like 30 to 67. All right, and then after him, by the way, just to make sure I keep everything in accord, You had Paul and Saint Peter there in Rome. But as far as like directly following Saint Peter was a guy named Linnaeus, and he became bishop there. And again, keep in mind that during this same period, going past 100 years, you had other bishops in other places too. But it's just that Rome is one of the centerpieces or center places. Pope Linnaeus or Bishop Linnaeus, he was in office from 67 up until 76 AD. And then after him, another guy named Anticletus from 76 up until 88. And then after him, another guy named Bishop Clement from 88 up until 97. Again, a year prior is when he wrote that letter, which is actually earlier or predates the documentation put forth from both Papias and Polycarp, obviously. His letter was to the Corinthians in Greece, who had like a dispute going on, like I say, and then he had to use. He basically was just saying the same, like made the point as far as like, okay, this is a particular apostolic foundation that goes back to the originators of our church, thus religion. Anything outside of that has to be in error. And then he quoted various scriptures to make his point. But this letter is not something that's made up. It actually exists or whatnot. But keep in mind the interesting fact that this is still during the same time when the Ebionites had to have existed. Granted, they they date them to 70. Yeah, yeah, yeah. When they actually when they existed at the same time. So yeah, he was the bishop up until like 97. And then after him, another guy named Evaristus from 97 to 115. And then after Evaristus, another guy named Alexander from 115 to 125. Then after Alexander, another guy named Bishop Sixtus, Sixtus, from 125 to 136. Then after him, Bishop Hyginus or Hyginus, which is Hyginus. Now, the notable thing about him, because all of these bishops, like I said, they were mentioned in Irenaeus's book as well. But one thing is like, as far as like my formula when I research, every time I come across names that I'm not familiar with, I always do like an additional Google research. And me doing that with these first 11 to 12 bishops, I found out interesting information about at least three of them that I found notable. He's one of them. Well, three or four. He's the second one. He's the person that started godparents, godmothers and things like that. I thought that was interesting. I never had godparents myself, but I know about it. I lived around people that profess to be Christians, so I thought that was notable. I had never heard of that before. That was an interesting precedent. And then after Hyginus, another another guy named Hyginus from 136 to 140. Another guy named Bishop Pius from 140 up until 155. Now, uh, no, actually, Bishop uh, Anicetus, Acetus, from 140 to 155, and then after him, Bishop Pius. Now that's the interesting person right there, and he was bishop from 156 up until 155 up until 166, if not 165. Now, as I was saying, as far as like the person of Jesus having to have or be something that or a person that actually walked around on planet Earth, and then these 12 first bishops being like legacies of him to where you could trace everything back to Jesus. This is another notable factor. There was a bishop in during the 19th century, early 19th century. This is around 1862 when the Civil War was still going on in America. Uh, it was a Puerto Rican guy, Puerto Rican bishop. He was the bishop of Puerto Rico at the time, in San Juan, Puerto Rico. He had made a trip to Rome, and he conversed with the Bishop of Rome at the time, and I guess they had really good relations. The Bishop of Rome offered to let him have Bishop Pius's body. That was fucking interesting to me. And so the guy, by the way, the Puerto Rican guy, the bishop, his name is Mariano Rodriguez Olmedo, Olmedo actually, and he attempted to have his body taken to Puerto Rico, but he kind of really was unsuccessful in doing it in that time period. But it did end up in Madrid, Spain, and then later on, fucking decades later, around 1933, that's when Bishop Pius's body was finally taken to Puerto Rico. Now, to me, that's fucking notable in itself. Bishop Pius, that will only be like shit a little bit over 100 years after Jesus, about like you could round it up about 130 years after Jesus or whatever. So I found that to be very interesting and significant. Now, um, Teleforus, I got them mixed up in the list. I forgot to mention Bishop Teleforus, but I'll just put that in heading or in writing on here, so I don't want to go all the way back. Now, as far as uh, Arius, for example, fast forwarding to Arius, I mentioned in my prior vlogs that Arius didn't necessarily believe in the Orthodox version or the Trinitarian version of Jesus. But me reading some of his works and going even more deeper, it kind of enlightened me even more. Not that there's a contradiction that I came across, it's just more enriching information. I didn't know that he put out like they call it a poem or whatnot. It was called Thalia. To me, it's not really a poem. It's like stanzas, a whole bunch of stanzas that he put together, but basically just explaining his viewpoint of God. And it was a lot of metaphysical information in that as well that I found to be interesting. He basically because when you think about like the early apostolic period back in the day, you had the Arians and these, by the way, these terms, like, don't get too lost to these terms. These are just like the term Arians and all of that. That's after the name of Arius. But come to find out, like a lot of what Arius believed as far as the Trinity wasn't necessarily like because he has he has some variations in his belief, but as far as like the Trinity thing, like believing that Jesus existed, and this is putting the logos to the side for a second, just to make it clear. As far as like the Trinity, people believing that Jesus was not co-eternal with God, yet he existed before time. That was like a belief that was espoused by a majority of the Eastern bishops, and that predates the lifetime of Arius, because Arius wasn't born until 250 AD. Some people say 257 AD. This goes back even beyond Origen, who predates Arius in existence as well. Now, one of Arius's, I guess you could say brothers, is a guy named Eusebius of Nicomedia. He became the bishop of Nicomedia, which is in Turkey. That's in like northwestern Turkey, like almost like the edge of northwestern Turkey. He became the bishop there for like 2 years, from 339 to 341. But he has a whole build up into that point as well. As far as him, like people like him, for example, he believed that Jesus predates time, yet Jesus was begetted. He did not always coexist with God. Now, that particular view was what a lot of the Eastern bishops believed in, but there's another term that also classifies it as well, which is homoousios. As far as like the opposite to that, which would be that Jesus and God are co-eternal, that particular concept or view, more so, I'm gonna be respectful, view is classified under the term homoousios. Then there's a third aspect that became a little bit, I'm gonna say it became popular. I'm not gonna say it just came into existence after the life of Arius, because there's a guy named Aetius who Arius is going to end up mentioning in the letter. I'll reference that in a second, but as far as Aetius, he also was a contemporary of during the lifetime of Arius as well, because by the time Arius died, Aetius would have been like 36. Aetius was born in 300 AD. But as far as him and then another guy later on, they ended up getting credit for this third term. And this is by the time, this is like after Arius died or whatnot from poisoning, I believe, because Arius died in 336 AD. And Constantinople. I can never say that word right, but I get to all that in a second. I'm trying to keep this in chronological order. As far as his third term is called Anomoean. Now that basically delineates the view that Jesus was a mere man. Again, just like Arius, for example, him not really being there, like as far as like homo ouiosios, that term is similar too. Like Aetius is not necessarily the first person to come up with that, just like how I mentioned with the Ebionites, for example, and also Tertullian. When you think about Tertullian, Tertullian was born, let me see, in 155 AD. Also, he was born in 155 AD, and he died in 220 AD. Right? Because his enemy was Sibelius. I get to all that in a second. Hopefully, I don't forget to get to it. But like Tertullian, for example, he believed that Jesus was a mere man. The other guy that I'm gonna break down in a minute, you could say the originator, just for the sake of argument, of this variant aspect, which Arius more than likely was beholding to regarding Jesus. But as far as his name is Paul Samosata. He also believed that Jesus was a mere man. So did Lucian, and etc. It's a whole host of people that believe this. But as far as like this third term, like I say, what makes it difficult is complex, because even though it points to Jesus being a mere man, there's still variations. I explain that in a second. So going back to the Eastern bishops, that's what they generally believed or whatnot. Uh, Arius, in his book Thalia, as he's breaking this down, he says that God is like the ultimate, like God doesn't have like basically God is like I can't even say the word, all powerful, basically, like God doesn't have an existence. Can nobody create God? And as far as the Son of God would not be considered a part of the same substance. Now, that's difficult to explain. I have to reference another person just to make the point clear. Now, I'm gonna bring back in Sibelius. Now, Sibelius doesn't really have a date. Not too much is known about his like when he was born or even when he died. But it is understood that he's from Africa. He's from Pentapolis, Africa, which is in Libya or whatnot. Uh, as far as the Trinitarian perspective, all right. Now, I'm referencing all of this to make it clear as far as what Arius had to say about Thalia and that tying to Jesus. As far as the Trinitarian view, Sibelius was also considered a heretic in a sense. When you fast forward from his life and you go to like Athanasius, for example, who was the bishop of Alexandria from like 328 to 335, and he became the bishop again later on. But he is like one of the most, a lot of people refer, as far as what I read, a lot of people refer to him as like the father of the Catholic Church. All right, when you think about Orthodox Christianity, the normal view, Jesus, God, and the Holy Spirit. He's a person that espoused that view and was the most popular on that side of the fence. Even though I found out some interesting information about him as well, as far as what Arius mentioned regarding him. But I'm gonna make this simple, so I'm not gonna mention that yet because I confuse people. As far as uh Athanasius, right? He would believe that Jesus and God was co-eternal. That Jesus is basically of the same exact uh substance of God, but there's still a distinction, in other words, right? And he also had even though they put like the term homo ousios, the first person to come up with that was Sibelius. But Sibelius's perspective is different from many of the Western bishops later on during the 4th century. Especially during this period, like leading up to 325, leading up to the Nicene Council or whatnot. As far as Sibelius's view, and this is what made Tertullian his adversary. God, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit were exactly the same. Now that sounds very similar to the Trinitarian view, right? Here's the difference. They are not just of the same substance. They are literally the same. So when Jesus was born on this planet, right, that means God literally manifested through the vessel of Jesus Christ. As far as Athanasius, when Jesus was born on the planet through an immaculate conception, granted, is still a distinction. Though Jesus is not different from God and the Holy Spirit, but they will still be like three masks of the same substance. Get what I'm saying? As opposed to like somebody like Sibelius, who wouldn't consider them three masks of the same substance. He would consider them all in the same. Now, before I get to Thalius, I want to point out that was one of the issues that Tertullian, for example, had with Sibelius. And Tertullian, by the way, just for me not to forget, he was also from North Africa. He was from Carthage, Tunisia, or whatever. The reason why he ended up becoming a heretic as far as Tertullian, because he was originally considered like a part of the church at the time, but he switched to another Christian philosophy called uh, Montacism or Montism. Uh, yeah, Montacism, and this is like around 207 AD when he did this. And him and Sibelius were right against each other as well. And as far as Tertullian, he also documented the Ebionites. See, that's why I want to do a specific vlog about him, because not only did he document the Ebionites, he touched on this guy named Elon, and he mentioned that Elon was actually the great grandfather of Noah back in the day. That's and then he also mentioned the original fallen angels and all this type of stuff. Again, this is going back to paralleling to alien type shit. You know what I mean? So that's why I want to do specific vlogs about that, because I veer too much. You know what I'm saying? But as far as like Tertullian and Sibelius, he felt like his criticism of Sibelius was that means if you accept Jesus, the Holy Spirit, and God as one, you kind of like demeaning, like you're relegating God. That means on planet Earth, when Jesus was crucified and he went through what he went through, he suffered. But the all powerful cannot suffer. It's impossible for the all powerful to suffer. So that was like one of his main criticisms of that view or whatnot. Now, even though he believed that Jesus was a mere man, we're gonna also point this out too, because it's similar to what I'm gonna mention about Arius too, and I don't want to go back to Tertullian too much. Tertullian also like he believed that because Jesus was a mere man, when he was baptized, and this is similar to Paul of Samo Sata as well. When he was baptized, that's when he was basically anointed. Anointed. And again, this would contradict, as far as Tertullian's concept or view, it would contradict God, because even though the Holy Spirit, God, and Jesus will be of the same substance, uh, they will still be like like separate masks. So the Holy Spirit would kind of like fuse with the person of Jesus, you could say, and it could be like God operating through him. But going back as far as Sibelius, Jesus would be literally God and human flesh. Now, as far as going back to Arius's stanzas and Thalia, which he published in 323 AD, he said that even though Jesus is like a like created before time, but not co-eternal with God, it still doesn't represent semblance. Now that is what kind of puzzled me a little bit. If you know about what the term semblance means, basically, Jesus still does not necessarily reflect God's essence. So I'm like, okay, because this is when I kind of interject myself into the mix kind of before I continue. The reason why that was kind of puzzling to me, because I'm like, okay, and I'm trying not to mention what he talked about as far as Arius, that Jesus come from non-beingness. I'm trying to hold back on that part for real quick. I'm like, okay, Jesus existed before time, yet not representing semblance, and he also used the word consubstantial, saying that he's also other than consubstantial, which means he wouldn't necessarily literally be just of the same exact substance of God. And then thinking about that again, going back to like somebody like Tertullian, for example, Tertullian considered Jesus to be co-substantial with God. So again, as far as me interjecting in my mind, analyzing this, I'm like, okay, now when I think about the logos, because in Constantine's letter that he wrote to Arius 2 years before, like 3 years before he let him back in the church, which is in 333 AD, he mentioned two things while trying to like make a plea, because the letter was kind of like general. He was speaking to Arius and he was speaking to the Eastern semi-Arians. But at that point, Constantine was more scolding. In his initial letter, he wasn't. I'll get to all that in a second. His initial letter was like in what? Uh, damn, 323 and 324, because he had wrote to both Arius and Bishop Alexander, because they were having a big dispute. I get to that in a second. I can't help but to jump around. As far as in that letter in 333, Constantine, he was saying like he mentioned two things. He was like, okay, Arius, even though he's speaking to a collective, but he had as far as like the address of the letter, he mentioned Arius' name as well, specifically, along with Arians in general. Arians in general. He was like, if you saying that uh number one, the vessel, basically, he was like, if you're saying that human flesh, he didn't use the term human flesh, but when you read this letter, you'll see. He was basically saying like, if you're saying like human beings, like our flesh is like what God manifests through as well, I agree with you there. Also, if you're saying the logos or the word, he said the word, but the logos and many times is also translated as word too. See, it's complicated, because like when you go back to this history, like a lot of people that believe in the Orthodox version, they translate logos as basically Jesus, merely just Jesus. Other people translate logos as like manifestation. That's how I see it also. Then you got some people that translate it as both manifestation and Jesus. But going back to this letter, as far as Constantine in 333, he was like, if you're saying the logos or the word of God, actually, word logo, same thing. It's very synonymous. He was like, if you're saying the word of God is uh like predates time, I agree with you there as well. Now, as far as the sun thing, based on what I know about Arius from reading his shit, me interjecting in my mind, I'm like, is he like, because like a lot of writings, they also like a lot of like theologians, especially the heretics, they do refer to human beings as like sons of men, the sons of men, the sons, plural, of men. So I'm like, in some of Arius' earlier writings, before he kind of like, backtrack, because he did, I'll get to that in a second. Definitely in 327. I mentioned that letter in a second. That's after, the Nicene Council, when he was basically excommunicated, or excommunicated. This is when he was already in Palestine, though. But I'm like, okay, when Arius talks about the Son of Man in Thalia, is he also speaking it like, okay, in other words, when he says the Son of God, does he also kind of mean, in a certain sense, a plural sense, like human beings? It like, does he mean human beings, the Word of God, and the logos at the same time, which means basically mere manifestations. Even when he highlights and says that the Son of God is superior to any other creation, I wonder, like underneath that language, is he trying to say like human beings in general? You know what I mean? Because how could you say like the Word of God comes, existed before time and it just manifested, and then you also say the Logos also manifests, and then you say Jesus is a part of that, but then you also later on refers to, or earlier on refers to Jesus as being coming from non-beingness, which is the same thing the Word of God come from. And this is when I have no choice but to go ahead and go into the history of Paul, mention Paul and what he believed, just to make the point clearer. Because Paul of Samosata believed that because Jesus was a mere man, he was not born through a virgin, that also during his baptism is when he was blessed with the term Christos, or the Paraclete, which is the same thing, or the anointed, or whatever. All of these are the same things. And this is where it gets interesting. This is where it's similar to many of the things that Arius wrote about in Thalia, when he was talking about like Jesus being like the like infused with God's will. This is what Paul or Sama or Samo Sata talked about. He said, because Jesus was a mere man, when he was baptized, he was blessed with the anointing, basically. And he specifically said this is what helped him perform those miracles. That's metaphysical to me. This is what helped him cure uh, people with diseases, the blind, etc. So, uh, logically speaking, that makes a little bit more sense. But again, this is when I interject for use my own brain on this, because I believe that people can do extraordinary things in general, and you could call it will. I break down will into three separate categories. Check out my blog called Metaphysical Addendum. You'll see exactly what I'm talking about. Okay, you got functioning will, you got incorporeal will, and then you got holistic will. Synchronicity is a beautiful fucking example. That's holistic will. That's collective. Anything that transcends the normalities of regular will, even like people that could do shit like when you have an adrenaline rush and you're able to do extraordinary shit like lift shit that you normally can't lift. That's still under functioning will. But when you're talking about like remote viewing, for example, seeing in a different location other than where you're at. You're talking about telepathy or telekinesis. That type of shit is kind of like transcendent of the flesh to an extent, to a good degree. So I would call that incorporeal will. Now, healing, the possibility of healing, I don't necessarily just throw that to the side. I think all that shit is possible, and I kind of have a good idea on how it's done. Like like people that don't get sick too much. You know that you could be in a certain circumstance or things could be going on around you, but you generally don't get sick. It has a lot to do with your attitude, whether you're conscious of it or not. But metaphysically speaking, I don't think that type of stuff is psychobabble. So as far as what Paul of Samosata put forth, that made sense. Only thing is, again, me interjecting, I think that's more general. I don't think it's like provision to a special individual. So going back to the writings of Arius, I wonder, does he kind of mean that? Because even though like Thalia is available, and I read this copy from a book from Athanasius, all of Arius, I always keep this in mind. This is why I don't feel like I'm like conflating or projecting. All of Arius's writings have been fucking burned. All of it. The only thing that's available is what his opponents put forth, basically. Like when like because these were debaters also back in the day. They debated a lot, so they'll take like what people generally do. You disagree with somebody, you'll break down what they believe fairly, without straw manning or without embellishing where they're coming from, and then after you present their case, then you put forth the reasons why you disagree with them. So all of his like thoughts was only available mostly through his opponents. There is a possibility that shit could have been misrepresented because, like for example, I'm just gonna mention it because it's relevant. Uh, Instead of just going in chronological order, I guess I'm just keeping everything pertinent as I go along. Going back to Constantine's letter that he wrote to Arius and Alexander of Egypt, Bishop Alexander of Egypt. He was the archbishop at the time. He was fueling. I get to that in a second, but just as far as just the letter, this was interesting. He mentioned this. Emperor Constantine. He said, "Listen, I think it's a good idea if you guys if you guys basically he's basically saying like both of them, even though they got differing opinions, they're basically still under the same umbrella, right? But uh, it is a bad idea to put your thoughts out publicly because even though like from Constantine's point of view, their disagreements would be like minuscule. Like he felt like the differences in what they believe, in other words, they both believe in God, right? They both believe that God is all powerful. Starting from that point, that's a base point that it makes them a bevy amongst each others. So everything else will be relatively minuscule for the point of Constantine. But at the same time, this is the highlight of why I'm referencing this letter ahead of time. He was like, uh, you got to consider the fact that when you put this shit out publicly, as far as y'all disagreements and y'all contentions, a lot of people have weak minds, as he was putting it. Not like weak, like you're just misled. He said like they don't have the grasp potential, like their comprehension is not adequate enough to catch on to a lot of the disagreements that these guys have, and being that they have a lot of uh, persuasion, like a lot of people follow and listen to them. When you think about like the pecking order all the way down, you'll kind of like put their minds in further disarray. Like they might not even know what the fuck they talking about in the first place, but because he listening to this person, they walk off a little bit more confused than they normally would have been, and then that puts them at odds with other people in their spaces, including like the most intimate spaces like family members. And he used the term dull also in addition. he was saying a lot of the general population, and he didn't just say like heathens. You know what I'm saying? Because heathen and pagan. Anyway, he didn't just say heathens. He said a lot of these people, the general population, is dull in the first place. So again, going back to as far as Arius, I'm like, okay, yeah, you got a lot of astute individuals, but still, you got different ways of looking at certain things. I wonder, like, is some of the language kind of like off a little bit? Like, did like I wonder, like during Arius's lifetime, did he kind of like view Jesus as like not even just view Jesus, but was he more inclusive when he talked about certain things regarding Jesus? So like, okay, for example, which letter was it? Which letter was it? It was which one? Which one? Which one? Which one? Which one? The letter in 320, right? Okay, I'm gonna pause on Thalia, for example. I'm gonna get back to it, but just I'm gonna lead back to it just to make the point clear. In 320, he had wrote a letter to Bishop Alexander, right? Now, I gotta explain the background up into this letter in 320. Because in 320, what I noticed in this letter, like he was being very fucking careful with the words that he was using or whatnot. Because okay, all right. As I mentioned, right, Arius was born in also Libya in a place called Ptolemaeus Cyrenaica, Libya, but he was educated in Turkey. This is when he became a pupil of Lucian. Lucian was also a pupil of Samo Sata. Keep that in mind. And and one of Arius's earliest documented letters, I read all of them shits, every letter that I'm mentioning, I read them all the way through carefully. One of his earliest letters was in 318, and that's when he wrote to his brother in perspective, the guy that I mentioned earlier, Eusebius of Nicomedia, right? Even though Eusebius wasn't a bishop at the time, but still, like I say, he had a lot of shit going on too. In this letter, a part of the yeah, in his letter, Arius refers to him as a fellow Lucian, or no, a fellow Lucian. So a lot of people, including myself, view that as saying as further validation that he was a pupil of Lucian, who was also a pupil or student of Paul of Samosata as well. But even in that letter in 318 that he wrote to Eusebius, he was basically just like venting. You know what I'm saying? He wasn't really going too deep into his perspective. He was just saying like, what am I to do because Alexander is picking on us and he's trying to get everybody like kicked out city from city. Hold on one second. Let me light this cigarette. I got a lot of fucking minutes on this phone. So this a different phone. This a different phone. This motherfucker ain't finna cut off. And I don't cheat, so I'm not gonna hit pause. See, I'm gonna do all this shit in real time. Damn, hold on. Oh, okay. Had to get my lighter and shit. Show y'all where I'm at. I'm in Louisville, Kentucky. Same place where Breonna Taylor was at. Hold on. Okay. As far as areas, right? After leaving Antioch or Turkey, he ended up in Egypt, right? Now there was another bishop at the time, a guy by the name of Meletius. It's not really exactly known when he was the bishop, when he first became bishop. It's clear that it was sometime during the early 300s AD. Or, I'm talking because you see, he was bishop up until 306. So at least fucking 5, 6 years, right? but he was the bishop of Lycopolis, Egypt. Now this is like during Christian persecution that was going on. I'm gonna break that down too in a second. It's a lot to fucking break down. This is during the time of Christian persecution that was going on, and you had a lot of people that wouldn't let okay, as far as like the Roman Empire at the time, a lot of Christians didn't want to pray to any idol gods or like pray like they didn't want to put the emperor above God. It was against their religion, and the penalty for that was basically death. And a lot of people went ahead and took the first option. Other people would try to run away, or they would recoil. And I guess recoil wouldn't be the best word. To, I guess it would be like a nice word or whatever. They're a coward basically. So as far as like a lot of bishops, you had it seemed like based on what I read, it seemed like the majority of bishops wouldn't allow them to recommune into the church. Some of them did. As far as Meletius at the time, he was one of those bishops that would preclude or make impossible anybody that cowered to re-enter the church or recommune. And Arius himself agreed with that. It was other things that went on concerning Meletius, but that's like one of the highlights or whatever. And this is also still including Arius's, I guess you could say, heretic teaching, because uh, Meletius had made him a deacon in Lycopolis at this time, right? So prior to Bishop Alexander, the bishop of Egypt at the time, the archbishop was a guy named Peter. Even though Peter ended up getting killed. By the way, Peter and Aquilas, the guy after him, they both ended up getting martyred or arrested and killed for their religious beliefs. But as far as the chronology of this, uh, being that Peter was an archbishop, he had superior authority over Meletius, even though Meletius had a great influence in itself, because it is mentioned that there were at least 28 other bishops, not just in Egypt, by the way, but collectively speaking, 28 other bishops that greatly supported Meletius. And then some of these bishops he also personally ordained himself. But because he was an issue, he ended up getting deposed by Bishop Peter at the time. Now, Peter was the bishop for at least 11 fucking years at this point. When Meletius ended up getting deposed, so did Arius get taken from his position as deacon in Lycopolis at the time. This all occurred in like 306. And uh, Arius wasn't allowed to recommune into the next bishop, because after Peter got killed, the other guy that I mentioned, Achilles, he became bishop for only like 6 months though. Exactly in December of 312 up until June of 313 AD. So during that 6 month period, sometime within them 6 months, I don't know the exact month, Arius was allowed to recommune. And but in Lycopolis or whatnot. So that same year after Achilles died, that's when Bishop Alexander became the Archbishop of Egypt with this authority or whatever. And he was the bishop up until 328. That's when Athanasius, the guy that I mentioned, like the father of this apostolic period, one of the most popular guys, one of the most popular overarching figures, that's when he became bishop after Alexander, even though Arius attempted to become bishop before him as well. But as far as Alexander, that's when he had issues with Arius, because what Arius was preaching became popular. A lot of people was listening to him, but he wasn't even a bishop at this time. And even when he was allowed to recommune in Lycopolis, he wasn't a deacon. He was considered just a minister at the time, a presbyter, right? But he had a huge following in Lycopolis and even outside of Lycopolis. And his following kind of also stretched all the way to Western Asia, to Palestine at the time, right? So Constantine heard about these back and forths or whatever. So you had riots, you had fights, you had things of that nature. Because around this time, that's when the leniency was granted to Christians, as far as like them not being persecuted. Because you had like the let's see, 311, for example. Who was it? Was it Valerian? Who was it? No, Galerius, I think. Sometime in 311 in April 30th of 311. He had a edict of toleration, even though like some scholars say like it wasn't really just an edict of toleration, it was really a letter. But he had it posted in Nicomedia, Turkey. And it's basically just granting freedom to the Christians within the empire. They didn't necessarily have to accept the emperor as a godlike figure. They just basically, the only stipulation they had in exchange for them to be able to worship freely as they do is to pray for the goodwill of the empire in general. So that was a precedent that was set 311 April 30th, right? And 2 more years after that, that's when Licinius became the emperor. And that portion of Roman history is pretty complex too, because you still had the tetrarchy going on. So it was always like multiple emperors, like almost fucking four of them. You know what I'm saying? Because Licinius, him and Constantine ended up becoming like co-emperors of the Western Empire. Even though like that kind of like snowball into something greater for Constantine in the long run, because you had Maxentius, all that. I'm gonna skip all that for now and keep it relevant on Arius, right? So yeah. So uh so Arius, was becoming very popular or whatever, and Bishop Alexander had a problem with this, so he would complain. So he tried to have like two meetings, right? This is before he finally excommunicated or deposed Arius. He had like two meetings, and those meetings did not result in him getting rid of Arius. So this is like when 318 comes up, like 5 years later or whatever, after Arius was allowed to, preach or whatever in Lycopolis. Uh, yeah, when he was able to recommune or whatever, but he was in Lycopolis. This is when 318 comes up. Now, 318, this is when Arius wrote that letter to Eusebius, right? And that's when he referred to him as a fellow Lucian. And in that letter, like I said already earlier, he was just basically venting. He was like, I don't know what to do. This guy, Alexander, this is what he was saying exactly. This guy, Alexander, is pissed off because I won't, agree with his public statements as far as Jesus being uh, unbegotten. You know what I mean? In other words, like again, going back to that Trinitarian view, Jesus being of the same exact substance with God. He's upset because I won't go along with that, and people are following me. But there's other people also that he's harassing as well, and he's steady trying to get us like to like banned from cities, etc. That's what he was basically venting about or whatever. And also, he mentioned this is when he mentioned, I think it was this letter, not the 320 letter. I believe it was this one, 318. This is when he mentioned atheists for the first time, which is also kind of contradictory to what I read, because everything else I read, as far as this apostolic history, especially when you get to the Anomoeans, they never make a connection between atheists and Arius during his lifetime. But Arius also mentioned him as also believing that God was also all powerful and distinct, very distinct from Jesus. But here's the aspect with Athanasius. I want to get out the way real quick. There's another factor that I found in reading that letter that I was like, damn, nobody ever mentioned that. Even though Athanasius is considered like a very popular apostolic father figure, and when he's mentioned, he's always connected with the Trinitarian view of Jesus and them being the same or whatever, or Jesus. He 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 basically mentioned Athanasius is also believing the same thing or saying the same thing that atheists and other people similar to the viewpoint of Arius would also say. I thought that was interesting because based on how history is told regarding Athanasius, that isn't the fucking case. But as far as this letter in 318, he mentioned that. And then it was like only like three other people granted from the east, a guy named Macarius, another guy named Hellenius, and then somebody else from somewhere in Western Asia who is not necessarily propounded on in a negative sense. But when I checked the list of these three persons, they also believe other than what the semi-Aryans or the Homo Oiosios believe. In other words, they also believe in like the Orthodox Trinitarian version as well. So I can understand why they didn't face too much negativity as far as from those exact individuals, such as Alexander, for example. Why they didn't face the brunt of his anger either. It kind of made sense. But and that's when Arius wrote that letter in 318. 2 years later, after that, in 320, uh, that is when Arius wrote to Alexander of Egypt, and he wrote to Alexander, or was it? I think it was Alexander in Egypt, and he's basically just trying to like explain his viewpoint and where he was coming from, and I also think that is actually when he mentioned the term "none." Jesus came from none beingness or whatever. But whatever the case may have been, it didn't help because that year, that's when Alexander set up a synod, which took place the next year in 321. And during that synod, that's when he was able to finally oust and depose Arius. When that happened in 321, Arius left. He went to Western Asia, another place. He went to Palestine or whatever. And he pretty much stayed there. This dispute still continued or whatnot. And then 3 years after that point, that is when uh, Constantine, who was a Christian, though other than the viewpoint that Arius shared, responded by writing to both of them. But his letter was incrementally written. So when you look up this letter, they're gonna have the date of 323 and 324. But the letter is composed like like you're not gonna come across two different letters. They basically put them all together, both together, whatever. But that's when he was speaking to Alexander and Arius, and he was saying like that's when he was saying like when what I mentioned earlier, as far as like y'all should kind of like keep this to y'all. Actually, he proposed for them to go ahead and have a debate to get that shit over with. But also, in addition to him proposing that, he was saying like y'all should keep this together, and he was saying they pretty much giving him a headache, they disturbing his peace, that he wanted to kind of like make a trip throughout Western Asia. By the time he got to Nicomedia, he's seeing shit he didn't like. He was seeing like the atmospherics basically. You know what I'm saying? Like people was at odds with each other due to this Aryan versus semi-Aryan thing that was going on. Again, don't get too lost in the words because like in the forest sense, you know what I'm saying, after this period, that's when it's really referred to this. People will more so like explain these literally as they are, the different beliefs from various people, but collectively speaking, these are like historically ascribed terms or whatever. But as far as Constantine, he was saying like, you know, he went to Nicomedia and he was like deterred from going any further just because of these disputes that was going on. and it's disturbing his peace and this and that. And he wanted them to get that over with and kind of like remedy the situation and any type of thoughts or disagreements that they had, just to keep it. This is what he wrote. He said, just keep that shit in your fucking head unless you want to get together, and then y'all go ahead and debate these, and then whatever like the whatever comes out, as the medium truth, basically that becomes the overall viewpoint. Other than that, this is causing like a big fucking disturbance or whatever. That's when he wrote that letter. And then in 325, also this same year, 323, that's when Arius wrote Thalia. Now I'm gonna go ahead and finish Thalia real quick. So yeah, like I was saying, I'm like shit, Thalia, like a lot of the stuff that he was saying in there, some of it, I don't know, some of it just kept on lighting my light bulb. Like I see what he was like. Basically, if you break down Thalia as it is, this is what he's saying. Like just on the surface of the fucking language itself. Okay, Jesus and God is not of the same fucking substance. Yet Jesus is different from just a regular created being or species. But at the same time, Jesus actually do predate time in itself. Yet the things that Jesus is able to do is done because of a fusion of him and the will of God. But Jesus is not also uh different from, like, he's also considered like a part of the word of God, or the word or the logos in itself. Again, going back to the term non-beingness. Now you see what I'm saying? You see why I feel like it's a little bit more to that or whatever as far as Thalia. So that's the stanzas that he put forth. I want to make sure because there was something else he said in that that I thought was that I thought was interesting too. I mentioned it already that he's other than consubstantial and uh, is not necessarily a literal semblance of God. You see, like the different, like you see those great intimations there. You know what I'm saying? That's why I feel like it's a little bit more to what he's saying. But ultimately speaking, uh, it's still not too far from what Paul of Samosata put forth or whatever. Because again, as far as him, he would say like Jesus was a mere man, yet he was anointed through the spirit of God or whatever. But again, this term logos that Arius would use, that is all a part of the same thing. These are logos and word. These are all manifestations of God. See what I'm saying? It's like it's a little bit of and not even a little bit. It is some ambiguity there. Yet that point is still sort of distinct from the general bishops of the East, obviously distinct from the bishops of the West, but from the East as well. So 2 years after that, that's when the Nicene Council was had or whatever. And basically every figure, even the ones that I'm not mentioning at this very moment that I will mention in like separate other, like follow up extra credit type shit that I'm gonna do to this, all of them attended the Nicene Council. Like a guy named Aristoteles, for example. I wasn't even going to touch on that, but I'm going to go ahead and touch on him real quick and then get back to Arius. He was the son of a very fucking famous guy named Gregory the Illuminator. I'm bringing the phone close because that plane is fucking loud. Of Gregory the Illuminator. Gregory the Illuminator. And before I even go further on speaking on that as far as Armenia, let me also say this is another thing that I found out. I thought at first that the Council of Nicaea was when Rome finally made Christianity a state religion. That's not really the case. It really supposedly happened in 381. So as far as like the Negus, they really are the second empire that made Christianity a state religion. And which is another thing, by the way, before I go further. I was going to include them in their history because there's a lot of shit that I found out in addition about them. I spoke on them before in a blog called Nadron. But me doing a whole bunch of fucking research for basically damn near 2 months. You know, I found out about even more like intimate relations between them and the Romans. Romans, for example, not only did Constantius visit uh, Zafar, which the Negus had under their umbrella at the time, he also and not only did Bishop Firmitius become the first bishop of the Negus people, the Negus Empire in northern Ethiopia. Uh, not only was he himself blessed by Athanasius, I thought that was like the extent of this intimate reaction between them and the Romans. That Firmitius was blessed by Athanasius, and as well as him becoming the first official bishop. Uh, and then given the title Abune Selama. But I found out as far as like Theophilus the Indian, because I mentioned him doing my blog on Najran as well, that Constantius II personally wrote a letter to the Negus. Sometime it's between like 354 and 355, possibly 353. But he wrote a letter and suggesting another bishop, a guy by the name of George, who also had a radical view as well, as far as like the God and Jesus connection. But I'm gonna save that for a different vlog. He wanted this guy Bishop George to replace Bishop Saint Bishop Firmitius, because he felt like he had like suspicion about Bishop Firmitius. He felt like he may not have been really qualified, that he may not have been teaching the correct doctrine or whatever, which is also interesting because Bishop Firmitius was blessed by Athanasius. Athanasius and Constantius II, including somebody like Bishop George and Constantius II had similar views, not exactly the same as the third radical aspect interpretation of Jesus, of the I know Mo En view, but more so closer to like the Homo Oiosios. But that in itself is still completely distinct in a sense from what Athanasius and Firmitius believed. So that was fucking interesting that he wrote this letter, and these are all facts. So I'm gonna do like a separate little vlog on that in itself as well. But I don't want to veer too much. Going back to Gregory the Illuminator, the first to the guy who basically facilitated Armenia becoming the first Christian state, and then the Negus after that, and then the Romans in 381 following them. But as far as Gregory the Illuminator, he was from royalty, right? Uh, his father was a guy named Anak, and his mother was a lady by the name of Okohe. Gregory was born in 357, I believe, 357. And the king of Armenia at the time was a guy named Khosrow II, and he was the king from 252 to 258. Uh, what ended up happening, because I don't want to skip like the name of his royal family or like the dynasty. Oh yeah, the royal family that he come from. They were like, what you call them? Uh, I forget, but it's like a royal family. They trace their lineage to the Parthians or whatever of fucking northeastern Iran. But anyway, his father ended up killing Khosrow II in 258. So to escape death, he was kind of like smuggled out of Armenia, and he went to Turkey. The people that smuggled him was a lady, but they're referred to as his caretakers, a lady by the name of Sophia, and then another person named Yevta, Yevtaughh. And they went as far as Cappadocia, Turkey, Caesarea Cappadocia, Turkey. And he was later given to another guy who was a Christian, and his name was Firmilianus. Firmilianus, and that's how he was introduced to Christianity. And he grew up a Christian, and he ended up meeting a lady by the name of Miriam, who was also a Christian, but she was from royalty as well. I believe from Armenian royalty also. They ended up having two children. His oldest son by the name of let's see what the fuck Ver, Vertanes, and it might be of a different tongue, but the way that it's spelled is Vrtanes. And then he had another son by the name of Aristaces. And again, it might be a different tongue, but it's spelled Aristaces, 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 and eventually Gregory the Illuminator decided to go back to Armenia to make up for what his father. It's weird to make up for what his father did as far as him killing the king there decades ago. When he went back to Armenia, the king at the time was a guy named Tiridates. T-R-I-R-T-R-I no Tiridates the third, and he had became king there. Damn, what shit? What was it? I forget exactly, but he was reigning at the time, and prior, just a little bit prior, yeah, at that time he had like a yeah, he was reigning at the time, and he ended up finding out about Gregory the Illuminator being there. So he had him arrested as revenge for his father killing his father or whatnot. And he threw him in prison. And they based on what I read, they say that he was placed in the pit for 12 years. The exact year that he was placed in this pit, I don't know. I tried to find out, I couldn't find out. But come to find out, around 297, uh, he was let out because what had ended up happening, the Roman emperor at the time, Diocletian, uh, ended up betraying him. Now, that was one of the guys that was persecuting the Christians. Like, this is somewhat prior to, uh, actually, it is prior to uh, uh, Arius going back or going to Alexandria, Egypt at the time. Uh, Diocletian was persecuting the Christians at this time or whatever, but he had like some type of alliance with the Armenian king, Tiridates the third, but he ended up betraying him or whatever. And supposedly this guy he was going crazy in his fucking head. They said that he lost his reason as far as the Armenian king. And, he was like greatly affected by this betrayal. So for whatever reason, he felt like Gregory that he locked up, that he had in that pit, for whatever reason, he felt like Gregory would be able to help him psychologically or whatever. So he let him out of prison. I'm gonna call it a prison, and that was in 297. Uh, they got cool with each other's, and he decided to make Gregory like to put him. He gave him a lot of power and decided to use him to convert their entire nation into Christianity, which started in 301 AD. When 302 AD came, that's when Gregory was blessed or anointed to be a bishop by one of his childhood friends, by the way, from Turkey, a guy named Leontius. Leontius of Caesarea as well, or Mazaka. Leontius of Mazaka, which is in Caesarea within Cappadocia, Turkey. So he was blessed in 302. Years passed from that point. I want to say about like 318. That's when 318 he had his oldest. I don't know if it's exactly 318 AD, but basically his oldest son, uh, Vartanes or whatever, he had a child by the name of Gregory, that he named Gregory or whatever. Damn, 1 hour and 24 minutes ain't cut off. Good shit. He had a child by the name of Gregory. And I guess he became old enough around this time, sometime around 318. So they had him also preach in Albania, uh, what they call Caucasian Albania at the time. So when they sent him to go do that, he ended up getting killed by a crazy mob that's referred to as a. He just basically got martyred by them or whatever. And then that's when Gregory had his oldest son, if not Aristaces, I mean Aristaces, or what was it his oldest son? He had one of them placed as the head of the church. This took place around 325. Yeah. It had to be Aristaces. He had him placed as the head of the church, and that's when Gregory decided to fall back. He decided to become like a strict monk for purely spiritual reasons, and then he left and went into like a location, a barren location or whatever, and spent the rest of his life there, getting more in tune with God, to build a more intimate relationship with God. And he left his son Aristides as the head of the church or whatnot. Now, going back to Arius or whatever. So in 325, he had got deposed. Again, I brought it up because Aristides was one of those people that was there at this council. So are many other fucking people that I'm not gonna mention in this vlog. I'm gonna be a little stingy and save many of these people that I want to talk about for like follow-ups to this. But yeah. So as you know, the decision was made. The Trinitarian Orthodox view was the overall official Christian view of the church at the time, even though these disputes or disputations and contentions still occurred. Many of the bishops in the East still followed what they were, or still were adhering or beholding to the interpretation of Jesus being begotten from God and predating time itself, but not co-eternal with God or whatever. That still took place, as I mentioned already. As far as atheists, he's going to end up becoming more popular with a more uh, with a more radical interpretation. It's not too far from other people in the past. But as far as conventionalism is concerned, like the preeminent conventionalism at the time, his shit is going to begin to protrude, and he's going to develop a following as well. So as far as Arius, 2 years after that, in 327, he ended up writing a letter to Constantine. Now, this is when he began. It's more clear. You know what I'm saying? Like you don't have to really analyze too much. When you read this letter that he wrote to Constantine in 327, he's using Orthodox language. He's professing Orthodox language because he was told that he would not be able to recommune unless he give up some of his radical aspects of what he believed or whatever. Now, it's weird because even though, like, when you read this, when I read this letter that he wrote in 327, to where he began to profess, he says it clearly. God, the God of Jesus is co-eternal, etc. Blah blah blah. You know what I'm saying? He used the Orthodox language. Yet 6 years after this point, he still wasn't let into the church yet. So it's a lot more that went on after this letter. I'm not sure exactly what it was because I didn't read anything else in addition. But the next greatest notable period is 333. That's the period when Constantine wrote to Arius and the Arians. And a good hint from that fucking letter is that aside from this dispute still going on, it seemed like Arius attempted to backtrack as far as that letter that he wrote in 327. Obviously, even though he professed this Orthodox version in that letter, 6 years later, for Constantine to write like I guess it was kind of like scolding. You know what I'm saying? Like he was saying, like, okay, In this letter in 333, Constantine was saying, this is what he was saying. He was like, there's a negative force out there. Keeping in mind that he was writing to Arius as well as these other people that believe in this view, even if not like completely the same as Arius, but still it's the semi-Arian view in general. He was like, there's Constantine was like, it's a force out there, a negative force that's like, he didn't say it's like sucking blood from people, but it's basically what he was saying. It's kind of similar to what Clement was saying in his letter in '96, when he was like, we was talking about like dissidents and shit, like people that's not really going along with, or people that's kind of like straying from the traditional foundation that has been fucking laid generations after generations, that should not be questioned because it is the closest to the truth from that or those persons, or yeah, from to Jesus himself. You know what I'm saying? This foundation has been laid chronologically, not even to like shit. What 97 will be what about 40 years after the life of Jesus or whatever. But you still had many of his closest disciples that were still alive at the time or whatever. So in the letter, Clement was saying like, anybody that kind of like disagrees with this foundation, they're basically troublemakers or whatever. Their presence is a threat in itself that could put everybody's spiritualism in peril. That's kind of like the same point in a sense that Constantine was making, but he was just a little bit more scolding. He was like, it's this negative force out there. It likes to like just grasp onto shit. And then the reason why I say he was a little bit more scolding is because, as opposed to his letter in 323 and 324, where he was more so speaking from a diplomatic perspective, he was actually throwing personal insults at Arius itself, which I found puzzling because I'm like, in 327 in his fucking letter, you know what I'm saying? In Arius's letter, he seemed to kind of be, not even seem, he was obviously yielding to that perspective. This is what I'm professing now, writing this in this language. That God and Jesus are co-eternal, this and that, blah, blah, blah. It was 180 degrees different from what he originally put out, especially different from what he put out 4 years prior to that in 323 in Thalia. So from 6 years, 6 years from 327 to 333, I was like, damn, I don't know, like in between that time, what Arius was doing. Obviously, I guess he would say one thing on the face, and it could be numerous reasons why. Obviously, he was still preaching what he believed. Yet, in that letter in 327, he seemed to finally profess the Orthodox version so he could be recommuned. I don't know if, like, it's obviously a contradiction in action just based on this letter. You know what I'm saying? The emperor was saying like he was questioning his integrity. Like it was like he was saying like, okay, basically you just causing problems and you being dishonest and you're using reasoning, like you're reasoning and you're using logic, but you yourself know what you're saying is not true. It's like you causing unnecessary confusion. And I'm gonna bring this into the light so the public can know about this. So everywhere that you go, basically, you're gonna be faced with this. They're saying light is the greatest disinfectant. That's essentially what Constantine was saying. And then by the end of the letter, he was like, hopefully, that's when he kind of like calmed down toward the end of the letter. He was like, hopefully you see the light or whatever, and you come to the truth and blah blah blah. Then he gave, like, within the midst of the letter, also he gave a prayer, but he was very scolding to Arius, and just based on the content of the letter, because I read it in full. Also, actually, it's the longest of all the other all the letters that I wrote uh, regarding Arius or whatever. It was the longest one. He was scolding in the fucking letter, but then, like I say, toward the end, he was like, hopefully you can come to the light, etc. Now that's in 333. Now, 3 years later is when Arius was finally let back into the church. You had two synods that went on, synods, one in 335 and then the one in 336. One in 335 was called the Synod of Tyre, and Athanasius was scolded at that synod. I believe he might have been instructed to attend the one in Jerusalem as well, and he probably missed the one in 335 in Tyre. But he was ordered to attend the synod. Like he was obligated to be there. He had to face some charges, a whole bunch of different charges, and one of them was that people accused him of threatening to block the trade from Alexander, Egypt, into what was it, Constantinople or whatever, and it was regarded as a serious accusation. Every other accusation he got cleared of and found innocent, but this particular one he was found guilty. So this is when he was ousted. And by the way, uh, during his whole little period, because Athanasius died in 373, ultimately speaking, he was exiled 17 fucking times by four different emperors or whatever. So this is not the last time he was ousted or whatever. But that is what took place at that synod. Arius was a part of it as well, and I think also he had like other people that kind of like spoke up for him because he was supposedly being mistreated by some of the bishops or whatever. And by the way, I forgot to mention this, but just because it's kind of relevant, during the Council of Nicaea, right? Like I said, everybody was there. Eusebius of Nicomedia, Eusebius of Caesarea, everybody was there. And there was a guy named Stephanus, right? He was a semi-Arian as well, because we had like over at least 100 bishops. Like, I think over 100 or at least 100 that attended the Council of Nicene. And Stephanus, who was a semi-Arian, right, by definition, when he got up to speak, he said, "How can we be considered Arians or semi-Arians when Arius is just a minister, a presbyter?" Now that goes back to the point that I was trying to make earlier. I just forgot to bring this up. As far as like, he was not the like there is some variation in what Arius believe, but as far as this Trinity thing, the general thing, as far as like whether Jesus predates whether Jesus is co-eternal with God or he just predates time. That's it. But comes after God. As far as that portion comes after God, that's what people generally from the East, as far as their bishops, believe. Those from the West didn't necessarily believe that. They believe that God and Jesus is co-eternally the same. But again, like those other persons that I mentioned, you still got like little subtle, not even subtle, you got undermining variations as well. And even with like the Eastern semi-Arians, there's a difference. There's a bit of a difference as far as what Arius believe in